adolescence.com or from the extravaganza if you've been to our annual event, and we'll say more about that at another time. This initiative is a dynamic partnership between the ELCA Youth Ministry Network, the ELCA and its youth gathering, and ELCA seminaries and colleges. Practice Discipleship offers leadership development for the sake of faith formation. The theme for this year is Story. There will be a series of 7 webinars that focus on Lutheran theology, ministry theory, and practical skills relating to our theme. Today's webinar is titled Story of Adolescence. Our presenter today is Dr. Dawn Rudman. She works at Spark House for Augsburg Fortress, and she's a product developer mainly so that churches have good resources for children, but she has worked with resources for teens and adults as well. You'll be able to ask questions, so before I hand it over to Dawn, just take a moment and look at the right side of your screen where you'll see a box. That is the place to type in questions, comments. We do want to hear from you. So I'll keep an eye on that box and pass those questions along as we go along. There will also be times when we ask you to participate, so please do jump in. We'll try to get to as many questions as possible. But let's go ahead and welcome Dawn. So welcome.
Thank you, Dawn. It's not often I get to be in an event like this with another Dawn, so it's a great opportunity.
Thank you. It's kind of fun.
Yes, so I would like to welcome all of you to this webinar on the Practice Discipleship session called The Story of Adolescence. And in this session, we will be focusing on the young people that you're serving in your ministry right now, between the ages of about 11 or 12 through 18 or 19. And for this webinar, I'm going to be referring to several sites where you can go to get additional information and data and fact sheets. We'll have several of those sites mentioned with URLs in the slides, and there are also a few handouts that support this webinar that you can access. You can stay tuned for more information on how to access those. And of course, at any point, if you have questions about URLs or where to get more information, you can leave a comment in the discussion box, or you can send me a message directly. I'm at dawn.runman@gmail.com. So what we're going to do is take a look initially at some demographics of adolescence. And what you're going to see in the next slide are 4 concentric ovals with 4 words that begin with C. And this is a sheet, this is a way to look at demographic information about adolescence using congregation, community, church, and country, and looking at those by obtaining some information from a number of websites that give really authoritative statistics. And what I'd like to start with is looking broadly at nationwide statistics regarding adolescence. And so that will be the next slide that you'll view here. And there's also an accompanying handout that you can reference after the presentation that helps you take notes and look up additional statistics. But if we start by understanding the youth in our midst, in our context, by the broader context of our country, of the United States, and just how many youth there are, what you'll find is that youth between the ages of 10 and 14 comprise about 6.7% of the population, and youth between the ages of 15 and 19 comprise just a bit more, 6.9% of the population. What this means is that youth make up about 13.5% of the United States population, which works out to be about 1 in 8 people living in the United States. And to me, that's an important point to start with as we look at these demographics, because as a youth ministry volunteer or professional, you are developing proficiencies and abilities and strengths that serve 1 in every 8 people. That numbers over 40 million people in the United States. And so it's a really important thing to look at how your focus on this age range is really an age range where 40 million people in the United States are between the ages of 10 and 19. And so there's a site that can give you more information about these data and how to get this country data. And so what we'll do is take a look at that slide just to give a quick look at where the census data is found. And again, you'll be able to link to this in the PowerPoints available, or in the handouts for this presentation as well. So this is just a quick screen capture of what that looks like on the United States Census Bureau site. Now, that was the first of the 4 C's. We'll take a look at the next slide, which actually helps you even drill down more. Depending on how you view Excel, it may be lowly or it may be lovely. But you can see right there in the first column under both sexes and the word number, between 10 and 14, between 15 and 19, we're looking at about 40 million people in the United States. Mm-hmm. So that is the first C. And the second C is that of church. And this C I wanted us to look at to consider how many youth there are in the ELCA. And we run into kind of a puzzling fact here in that the most recent data that have been examined, the chart we'll look at in the very next slide shows data that were collected in 2008. And unfortunately, and I haven't been able to find anyone who knows why, information was not collected on the 0 to 14 population range in the ELCA, but this chart does show a comparison of the United States population by age compared to people attending an ELCA congregation. Again, these data are from 2008. But what you can see is that about 8% of ELCA, 8% of the U.S. population is between 15 and 19, but only 4% of ELCA attendees were in that population. And so we're looking at about half the number there, and that 4% number is about 1 in every 12 ELCA members in that sort of youth demographic. So that's a second way to look at who are these youth that we serve in our ministry. We've looked at our country, now we're looking at our broader church in the ELCA. The next slide that we'll take a look at has to do with the C of community. And you can find information on who's in your community by looking at, again, the census tools. And when you go to the site that contains quick facts with census information, you click on the state you're interested in. And so in the next slide, you're going to be able to see specifics on Cleveland, Ohio, which is the birthplace of our presiding bishop, Elizabeth Eaton. So I thought that would be a good site to look at. And so when you're bobbing around the census site and you're taking a look at specific regions, you can go into metropolitan areas and take a look at the persons under 5 years of age, persons under 18 years of age, just to see what percentage of the overall population is comprised of these age demographics. And so throughout this presentation, as we're looking at these URLs, please feel free to open up another window and take a look and look at your own city. That might even be something you want to do now, and kind of post, what are you learning about what percentage of people in your community are under the age of 18. Mm-hmm. So that's the C of community. And we have one more C to go, and that is the C of congregation. And so in your congregation, I know we're a couple months away from when most congregations do their annual meeting, but you might happen to have a copy of your annual report just laying around your office. Maybe you laminate it. But if you don't have that annual report, you can go to the ELCA site that provides congregation trend reports and take a look at the information that every ELCA congregation is required to submit. And what I've done here is just give you a screen capture of my own congregation. I attend Edina Community Lutheran Church in Edina, Minnesota. And you can see there, especially in lines A and row A and row C, sort of a look at young people in our congregation, how many baptisms per year, and then how many are doing an affirmation of faith. Oh, sorry, that's different from confirmation, but this trend report for your congregations is going to give you some pretty interesting information about demographics right in your congregation. And so you may not have known, we're going to spend the first 10 minutes of this webinar looking at demographics.
But it's fascinating.
But it's fascinating, and there are so many ways to explore the settings where you're living and the settings of the youth you're serving. And so sometimes I think it really helps to take a big picture view of what is it like to be an adolescent in 21st century America.
Right.
From that big, broad context down to your own congregation or just the city or town that you live in. So a few questions to consider here, and I would love for you to take a moment and enter in your observations here. But which of these data points are most surprising, revealing, or compelling to you? And it could be some of the data that I've shown you. Maybe you're fascinated by what the Cleveland statistics said, but which of these data points are most interesting to you, especially if you've been entering in information about your own communities? So what are those features of youth in your context that matter to you? And I think this look at the 4 C's is interesting, even when we consider, what do we know about Jesus when he was a young person? And if you think about the story that we have from Luke, where Jesus is in the temple as a youth, that's in Luke 2:41 to 52, and his adolescence, and what might we know about his individual congregation, about his community, about the broader church and the country that he lived in. We can even sort of look at that perspective too. So
if you, I'm sorry to jump in, but those of you listening live, jump in on the box on the right side and let us know what's been surprising or revealing or compelling just looking at the data. I know I have some thoughts, but I want to hear from you first, Dawn.
Sure. Well, I hear another C word a lot when I'm in conversation with people in ministry, or when I'm following, threads on Facebook, or just sort of hearing what's on their minds, and that C word is context. And believe me, as someone who develops curriculum, we know the challenges of trying to develop a curriculum that fits everyone, because we know people have different contextual factors that affect their ministry. A really obvious one, well, how many kids are in your group? But
right.
There are so many other ones looking at, do all your kids go to 1 or 2 of the same high schools or middle schools, or are you spread across 4 or 5 or 6? What are the expectations for kids in your community to be involved in extracurriculars, or maybe they're working a lot of hours, maybe some of them are involved in childcare in their own families, or other sort of contextual factors that affect how you can do ministry with them. I think that you're always sort of gauging that context, and you're probably finding that you have to change your assessment of that from year to year as the demographics of the kids change. Like some of them graduate, you get new kids in the youth group, and some of those may change not even just yearly, but on every quarter you're kind of reassessing. But I think taking into account context of where are these kids coming from, and sort of realizing that can be fluid in some cases. That's just another kind of layer I wanted to add to all this, and knowing your kids' context, and knowing that these might be some starting points of saying, I want to get to know a little bit more about my community. A lot of those census statistics you can look at have to do with things like income, have to do with things like, say racial and ethnic makeup of your community, have to do with the types of businesses and industries, so you can get an economic profile in that way. So I think for me it's interesting to look at changes over time. It's interesting to look at, within, I think anyone looking at their congregation report, you always find some surprises, some things you didn't know about your own church. And I also hope that we get to a point where we can get some more data collected on the youth and children in the ELCA, because right now that's an area that typically is not researched. So those are a couple of my takeaways.
Yeah, we have one person saying perhaps not all congregations need to report people until they're confirmed. That might be a reason we don't have data for people under 14. John was saying most revealing to him is that in his rural community they have lower percentage of adolescents than on the average when you showed the the whole country. And someone else said that reveals itself in their congregation as well. I was just seeing how the ELCA skews much older than the United States does.
Yes. Yes, there are some huge discrepancies there between the percentage in the overall population of people in those different ages versus ELCA members. And obviously it's the bar is high starting at about age 45 through 49 up through 75 through 79, and that's just for people who are thinking about strategy and vision and ministry, and also how do you serve those older adults, and what are the challenges of having older populations. How do you make sure your ministry serves them as well as looking at the youth in your midst? So I think that's a really interesting graph, a really interesting table to look at and figure out those discrepancies.
For the experience of a teenager, when they're in the larger culture, they are highly represented and being spoken directly to because they are such a big part of the larger culture, but then when they come to church, they're a very tiny, perhaps overlooked little segment.
Yes, yes. That's an interesting thing, too, to bring the disparity between sort of broader culture of a youth versus what things are like when they're in worship, when they're in the church community.
And how they experience that as humans going through life. Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you.
Sure. Anything else, Dawn, that you want to report on as far as questions?
Not right now, so let's keep going. And everyone, you don't have to wait for Dawn to ask a question. You can also just comment whenever. I just wanted to put that out there for people to be clear.
Do.
So go ahead, and I'll let you know when there's more activity.
Sure thing. Well, this next slide is kind of giving us 4 big picture areas to look at. And I'm just going to keep this slide up the whole time that I'm talking about these 4. What I'll do is when I come to a URL that has more interesting and helpful information, I'll give that to you, and you might want to capture that, and we'll also make sure those are available later in the session. But I know my background is in developmental psychology, and I focused in graduate school on the first few years of life, but did a lot of study of just the general human lifespan and especially youth development. And when I was, my first job after graduate school was working at a university and teaching classes in human development, and so did a lot of teaching in that area as well. So I think there is so much that the field of psychology has to offer us when it comes to our ministry, for better understanding them, for informing us of unique needs that some of our youth may have. And so when I was preparing this, and it was, gosh, almost a year ago when I was asked to prepare this session, I thought I want to look at some topics, not as sort of an exhaustive look at topics related to psychology that affect youth, but just some that I think are kind of big picture ones here that might help people as they realize they want to look more in depth into maybe 1 or 2 of these. Recognizing, of course, that whenever you have unique needs of your youth emerge, there's lots of support out there in the field of psychology to help. So I want to cover these 4 topics just so you have a quick look into why I think they're important for youth ministry professionals. And again, I'll give you links of where to go for more information. And the first topic there on mental illness, mental health is, you know this already. You know that adolescent mental health is a topic that's worth investigating. And when you look at the statistics provided by what's called the National Alliance on Mental Illness, or NAMI, N-A-M-I, the statistics they provide are that 4 million young people in the United States between the ages of 9 and 17 have a serious mental disorder diagnosed. 4 million young people. That is an enormous number. In a population of 300 million. And so there are several types of mental health disorders that may occur. What researchers have found is that the most common ones affecting adolescents are depression, anxiety, substance abuse disorders, and eating disorders. And I know, we could have an entire webinar on any one of those topics, but it might be that there's one topic in particular that is something you are feeling you need to look into right now because of a youth affected in your midst, or just because it's an area you want to learn more about. But I'll point you to several federal agencies and research institutes that provide really helpful resources that help you get a glimpse of, like, what are the causes, what are the symptoms, how does treatment happen. And so one of those sites is the Department for Health and Human Services, which is just hhs.gov. And they actually provide in-depth information by state on different mental health issues. So that's a helpful one for looking more closely into your context. And there are also a number of resources available at the National Institute of Mental Health when it comes to youth and mental illnesses, because they have a number of fact sheets. And fact sheets are a great resource because typically they're just really easy to download PDFs of 1 or 2 pages that gives you a quick look. So that, for example, if you find that you have a youth who has a type of anxiety disorder or bipolar disorder, you could go somewhere like this National Institute of Mental Health site and just start the process of learning more about, okay, what is this disorder? What do I need to look for? What are the challenges that this youth is facing?
Look, building on that idea of fact sheets, Mark wrote, there's also the Boy Scouts of America. Are you aware of this? Some fact sheets. So thank you, Mark. He's suggesting to Google Boy Scouts of America Environmental Scan. And he says they have a ton of data, but it's organized into 1 to 2 page segments that are ready to be handouts or downloaded. So thank you, Mark. We can look into that as another resource. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you. I had one more that I wanted to share, and that's a site called the National Adolescent and Youth National Adolescent and Young Adult Health Information Center. That URL is a mouthful, but I'll make sure that people can have access to that afterwards. And this place actually bills itself as a one-stop shop for adolescents and young adults' health statistics and information. And so I think we all know the feeling we can have sometimes of being so overwhelmed by all the information that's available to us online. I think knowing that there are these few major agencies that are doing significant research and that are trusted and considered authorities in the field, it's really helpful to have those even, bookmarked on your mobile devices, on your laptop or your desktop computer, so that you can go to those sites and learn more about different topics like this. And with yet another very tragic shooting happening recently, I think about I know so many people who live in central Wisconsin, and I know this shooting in Menasha must just be devastating for the community there. We don't know when some type of trauma happens in our community. It's really important that we can have some quick access to resources that could help us deal with those kinds of traumatic situations, among others. So there's a lot of information out there, and you can sort of do the work maybe before the significant incidents happen to say, like, these are the authoritative sources that I want to reference. So there's no shortage of this kind of information, but what does this mean for you as youth ministry professionals? And as I think about mental illness and the prevalence of these mental disorders, again, remembering that there are 4 million young people affected by these, you may know youth, you probably know youth who have already been diagnosed with a mental health diagnosis, and you might even be thinking of someone right now. But I want you to consider that it's actually pretty likely that in your ministry you will be involved in the life of youth and their families right at the beginning of their journey into being assessed and treated for having a mental illness. And that is because the onset of adolescence coincides with the onset of mental health problems for so many people. I want to cite just one study that said, this was a study of over 9,000 people, half of all lifetime diagnosable mental health disorders start by age 14. So when you look at things like depression, anxiety, eating disorders, substance abuse, other types of mental health diagnoses, in this study they found that half of those started by the time a kiddo was in 9th grade.
Wow.
And that's a really, that's a very monumental role you could play in the life of that youth and their family, because you might find that that diagnosis is starting to happen right when they're in your junior high, your middle school, or your high school youth group. And you might not be, on the mental health team doing that initial assessment, but maybe you're asked to fill out a behavior report. Or maybe the youth and their family decides to involve you in letting them know that they're going through this process. Maybe you're being asked to pray for the family. Maybe you're being asked to, visit them in the hospital if that's where they are. So you might just be praying. You might be in conversation. You might be helping them with encouragement. But you are serving, I think, a pretty unique role in that you have this theological point of view of saying, we are all broken and we are all not well, but we are children of a God who is there to love us and restore us. And that voice, I think, is so important in the midst of all of the processes that can happen with, statistics and profiling, and we have to do this blood work and we have to make this diagnosis, and, which axis on the the DSM-5 axis disorders, are you being diagnosed on? There's so much technicality that can go with those diagnoses, and of course I'm not doubting for a minute that mental health providers can be doing just excellent work and really helping kids and families, but
of course,
your role can be so different than all of the rest of that, because you're helping them see how they are still a beloved child of God. And in the midst of all the things where they're maybe just hearing repeatedly all the things that are wrong with them, you can be there to affirm the things that you love about them, things about their personality that you really appreciate. And I think in youth ministry, a lot of times, unless we are deliberate about seeking out kind of training ourselves or maybe taking continuing ed classes, or, I've certainly met a fair number of youth ministry professionals who also have counseling degrees, but even if you don't have those kinds of things, really really looking at what your unique role might be in supporting a youth and a family if you are with them on their journey for diagnosis and treatment.
Thank you.
So sure, you're very welcome. I don't know if anyone is sort of writing in questions now. Of course, we want to maintain confidentiality, so we're not asking for specific case studies or anything like that. But my guess is that for at least some of you listening and tuning into this, you have been part of this journey, or maybe you're on it right now. Maybe you're just getting started, and there is a lot of information out there for you. There are resources, but don't forget that your role as a minister can be such a vital one as a youth and their family sort of starts that journey of diagnosis and treatment.
I think one of the most helpful quick takeaways, you said so much really, really good stuff that will take some research perhaps from people, but just that very simple thing of you can be the one reminding them of the good things they have and the good person they are and what you appreciate about them. That, just that is something that I don't think we remember the power of, but everyone can do.
Right. Agreed. So,
oh, I'm sorry. We just have Andrew. I apologize. I didn't notice Andrew. Incredible importance of supporting parents through challenges of raising a child with a diagnosed mental illness. So
yes.
Thank you, Andrew, that you know the whole family better than perhaps the teacher at school or the mental health professional.
Right. And if we think about the network of people affected by this diagnosis, it might be that the youth in your ministry is not the individual being diagnosed and treated, but maybe it's the sibling. And we know sometimes with siblings of someone in the family who needs sort of a disproportionate amount of time and resources and attention, they can feel pretty ignored, pretty overlooked. And so maybe your role in serving that family is actually really lifting up the sibling and listening to them, checking in with them. How's this going for you? That might be another way you see your role in ministry.
Awesome. And then Laura pointed out that the perspective of a minister who themselves has a diagnosis can be a blessing. Thank you, Laura.
Yes. That type of disclosure, I think, can be really powerful, so that they don't feel alone, and also so they see an example of an adult who's in ministry, who has this diagnosis and has learned how to live with it positively. I think there's just so much there, from that theological point of view of, maybe not cure but healing, that we can offer, that just really, attending to the spiritual needs of the youth that we serve, in addition to all the other ways their needs are being addressed.
Thank you. Well, let's get to these other boxes. I want to make sure we hit them all.
Sure. I did want to mention, along with the mental illness topic, you'll note that the title in that box is mental illness, mental health. There is a growing field of research looking at factors linked to healthy mental development in youth. And the field in psychology is called positive psychology, and the psychologist named Martin Seligman is the one who typically comes up first when you're looking at positive psychology. They have, he and others in the field have looked at attributes and characteristics linked to healthy development. And I think one of the great windows into mental health and what churches can do comes when we look at the work of the Search Institute. And you may be familiar with the Search Institute's developmental assets for healthy development. The Search Institute has conducted extensive research to identify developmental assets in youth that are linked to healthy outcomes, and it probably does not surprise you to hear that many of these assets are supported by the work we do in congregations. So yes, we need to know about those mental health or mental illness topics, but also know as a church broadly and as an individual congregation, and you as a caring, attentive adult, you are doing things to contribute to the mental health of youth as well.
Thank you. So we're about halfway through our time. I'm glad you brought that up. I just also want to keep moving so we get to everything. It's all so good.
Yes. Well, we'll keep moving here. If you look in the blue box there, you'll see a topic that maybe you've read about lately, and that is one of early onset puberty in girls. And this, I wanted to sort of tackle two topics having to do with gender. So one is this early onset puberty in girls, the other is the boy crisis, as you can see there. But there is a growing number of studies showing that girls are starting to undergo the changes of puberty much earlier than in the past. And you may have heard this from maybe a colleague who teaches in a school, or from a friend who's a parent, or just read about this, but signs of puberty starting as early as age 6 or 7, which is a really kind of challenging thing to wrap your head around. So in clarifying definitions here, puberty is the developmental period of time sort of defined by all those physical changes of adolescence going on, and some of those physical changes are more public, some are more private. Adolescence is a much broader term that describes the time encompassing this physical growth, but also all the cognitive, the social, and the emotional changes. So puberty is actually a much smaller span of time than adolescence. So what we're looking at is that onset of that physical period happening earlier than what has happened in the past. And for those working with kids in elementary school, because this, of course, is when it's going to start showing up, they have found that more and more doctors were documenting signs of early onset puberty. This really got into the national conversation in 1997 in a study of over 17,000 girls. And there's sort of an updated study from 2010 in the journal called Pediatrics that verifies that this is a phenomenon happening in some girls. And the reasons behind it, they're looking into a lot of things. Some of them include increased occurrence of obesity, exposure to environmental chemicals, and actually some research that's found that early onset puberty is more likely to happen in girls who grow up in households without their biological fathers present. So that's a whole other, sort of figuring out why that's happening. But This is something going on. We don't, as youth ministry professionals, we don't have the expectation that we're going to help stop this in its tracks, but we can understand that this is happening. And then I think there's some real important implications to think through as a youth ministry professional. One is just being aware of these changes. The girls in your youth group, or maybe it's the girls in children's ministry who are starting to experience this earlier onset of puberty. So, they're starting to wear a bra, and they're getting their periods in elementary school. And I think it's really important to be mindful that these changes might be occurring to some girls in your group, and they might be really self-conscious about that because they feel like they're the only ones going through this transition at such an early age. So I think being aware of these changes is really important, and also knowing that you might have parents coming to you or other caregivers for just support or information. I think that some parents still do look to the church as one of the places where kids can develop healthy understandings of human sexuality. And so it might be that you and maybe those in children's ministry in your congregation have to think through, well, what do we do to support this and helping kids recognize themselves as creations of God and emerging sexuality? And is this something where, maybe you start talking about it earlier? Again, whatever's going to fit your context. So I think being aware of the changes, listening to kids' caregivers, and then also adjusting expectations, because sometimes we find that if a child looks older than his or her peers, in this case her peers, we might have the expectation that then she'll behave in a more mature way, or that she's more cognitively able to understand more complex kinds of things, or that she'd be more mature. And those expectations might not always line up with what she's actually capable of. So she might look very mature, but she's still on the immature spectrum when it comes to her behavior. So just sort of making sure our expectations kind of match up with what we're expecting from other kids of that age, rather than just considering physical appearances is pretty important. And then finally, providing a place that's really safe for kids, that's really accepting. And girls undergoing this early onset puberty may especially need that when they feel like things are happening to their bodies that they're not quite sure what's going on. They know it's different from the other girls that they're friends with, and they might even find that the responses from other people are sexual in nature. So they want a place that's safe and that's going to accept them. And this might mean that you rethink, like, oh, what fourth graders wouldn't want a big pool party with all of them, or something where, everybody's in a swimsuit, or that sort of thing. And that might not be the most appealing thing for girls if they're undergoing this set of biological changes earlier.
Right.
So, anyway, I did want to mention that in this webinar to think about how this is happening more and more. And you might need to talk with other professionals or read about this more to sort of see, how might I deal with this, or how should I be dealing with this right now if you indeed have a girl who's undergoing puberty, years and years earlier than others in the group.
Thank you.
Sure. I'm wondering if there are any questions or observations about that particular topic.
No, more just people thinking about particular kids saying, oh my gosh, I hope she doesn't go through early onset puberty, I'm not ready. It's more personalized things like that.
Yeah. But it's in some ways it's difficult. I mean, to read the accounts I've read of the third grade teacher who needs to deal with the fact that a girl in her class or his class gets her first period in school, and how that just how can this be happening? But recognizing that they need support, and they need to know that they're okay and that they're accepted, and that we can be some of the people who are teaching them that bodies might be confusing to us sometimes, but they're still an amazing gift from God to us.
Yes, thank you.
Sure,
thank you.
Sure. So if folks have an additional question or comment about that, they can certainly post. But let's take a look at the yellow box there called the boy crisis. And this is another term that's been present more often in just sort of looking at cultural or societal trends. And the boy crisis, I decided to identify this as another sort of gender-related topic. because of a number of outcome differences between boys and girls that have been assessed and measured over many years now. Here are just a few statistics. Boys are twice as likely as girls to be diagnosed with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, 4 times as likely to commit suicide, 5 times as likely to be in juvenile detention, 5 times as likely to die of homicide. Boys in secondary school receive 70% of D's in failing grades. They drop out of high school at higher rates than females, and even in the area of college enrollment, we see a disparity where the male to female ratio is now 2 to 3. So only 40% of enrolled college students are males, rather than it being a 50-50 balance. We, of course, want great outcomes for both boys and girls, for both young men and young women. So it's not to say that we want those statistics to flip. We want all of them, to go down when it comes to those negative outcomes. But those discrepancies are really important to note. And I think, the causes for these can be extensive, depending on which studies you're reading. When it comes to what's expected of boys in school, just the prevalence of violence, what does society expect for boys and men. You can access a lot of those statistics just by Googling a term like boy crisis. But I want to have us take a look at what this means for youth ministry professionals, in part because there's another discrepancy between males and females, and that is worship attendance. In a poll that I found recently that Gallup did in 2010, women have significantly higher worship attendance rates than men. And, we can see this playing out in congregations where it's, the mom is always the one bringing her kids to church, and then like maybe Christmas and Easter dad comes along, but for the most part it's the female bringing kids. And so, of course, that means that boys are seeing that their moms bring them to church and say this is important. And they don't get that message from their dads if they're in a 2-parent household, male, female. But thinking through, what do we do in our congregations and in our youth ministry that leads to this? What is it that has a boy grow up to be a man and say, I don't want to be part of this church community or any church community? And just recognizing what is our spectrum of ministry offerings. I think youth ministry, you do an amazing job, all of you, in offering great things for youth, because if it's not compelling, they're probably not going to want to come to it.
Right.
But how do we address this discrepancy so that we're appealing to girls and boys in our churches, knowing that within each gender there's a whole range of preferences and strengths? So if you haven't applied kind of a gender lens recently to looking at, what are you offering in the range of ministry opportunities, in the range of how kids are being educated in the faith, what confirmation looks like, I think keeping an eye out for how that might be maybe more skewed in one way or the other, it is kind of a good move to take there. And I would also point you to a book published in the last few years called Coming of Age, authored by Raleigh Martinson, David Anderson, and Paul Hill, where they did quite a bit of qualitative research into the lives of dozens of young men to look at what it was about church communities and other types of experiences that help nurture their own spiritual formation. That's a really great resource for looking into that specific gender issue more deeply.
So that book we can also link to the Amazon page or whatever is necessary. So it's Coming of Age, though, if you're listening right now and you want to Google it.
Yep. So I don't know, some of you may be listening in about the boy crisis and thinking, oh, yep, I can picture how this is playing out in my congregation, or maybe you've done some work to look at how to address the needs of boys and girls, and again recognizing there's lots of variability within each of those genders, but I think that's something to consider as well, because there's so much about the broader society that puts a lot of boys at greater risk for negative outcomes for a number of reasons. So Dawn, anything on the question front or comment front that people have added about this?
No, but there is interest in the book, and we've already put the wheels in motion to post the link. Never fear.
Great, great.
Yes.
Good. All right. Well, let's take a look at that last, or not take a look. Let's listen a bit for this last box here on digital natives. And the topic of technology, how can you not talk about technology when you're talking about youth? Just because I think that's sort of, fairly or not, that's always associated with, you know, anyone under the age of, I don't know, 35 these days.
Right.
But looking at the fact that youth now are widely given this label of digital natives, in that they didn't have to learn about digital technology separately. It's just part of how they're growing up. It's part of daily life. And so I think looking at the this topic about technology really comes into play when we hear about cyberbullying, when we hear about sexting, we hear about, you know, Tinder and you know, online dating, and there's a lot that comes up that is so new. It's kind of hard to stay updated because the digital world changes so quickly. Mm-hmm. And indeed, when you read studies on youth and technology, a lot of times they get dated pretty quickly because new apps and new platforms come onto the scene, and everybody switches over to those things. So you have to kind of stay current. But I do have just a few points from a Pew Center study from now 2012, so about 2.5 years ago. And big picture stats from this study are 95% of teens between the ages of 12 and 17 are online. About 80% have a cell phone and a desktop or laptop, and over 80% of teens use some kind of social media. So we know that that's where they are. That's where they are. That's where they're living, and that's their lens for looking at a lot of things. I want to first point out that there's a great site called Common Sense Media. If you are looking at, oh, should I show this music or should I show this movie at the lock-in or not, or what is this video game like, or this, you know, other type of media, Common Sense Media, it's even an app now, is a great source for media recommendations and ratings of things like movies and video games. So it's Common Sense Media, and they also conduct studies to track media trends in kids and youth, and they have a great study from 2012 called Social Media, Social Life, How Teens View Their Digital Lives. So there's some really great results from that study that you can check out. So I would recommend to you as just a quick resource, excuse me, Common Sense Media. And then second, there's a researcher named Dr. David Walsh. He's done a lot of work looking at technology and how the brain functions and sort of how the interplay between the two. He's got a site right now called Mind Positive Parenting that has a lot of content very applicable to others who are in roles of leadership with kids.
Quick drink of water.
Quick drink of water, yes.
I believe in it.
So he does a lot on looking at brain research, looking at technology, looking at youth, and just providing really reasonable ways of thinking about how can youth interface with technology really effectively. And so, excuse me, those are a couple of sources, but you can consider in your own setting, maybe you can take a closer look at your own technology policies, and you might have some practices in place, like do you have youth have their phones on the entire time so they could look up information, or, you know, use their phones as they will use their phones, or, you know, does everybody's cell phone go into a basket or container at the door and you have time together one-on-one? So I know people have different policies, different approaches to that. And I think just clarifying, you know, what are your expectations for media so that they know, for example, we're going to have pizza together and no one's going to reference their phone because we're together and we're going to have a great conversation. Like just things like that of how they are getting guidelines or boundaries for how media is used or not during your time together. And I think I'd also encourage you to embrace sort of the Lutheran concept of both and. That is, you can have fluency, both fluency with technology and media, and you can give many, many opportunities for face-to-face communication where you are really present for each other and the technology is not there. And I think we won't see maybe until some research starts coming out in the coming years, what does it mean? What do friendships look like? What do marriages look like? What do family relationships look like with a population that is so used to not even talking to each other anymore on the phone, but just writing things out in 140 characters or less?
Right. Andrew brought up, oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
Andrew brought up Dr. Rich Melheim's work with Faith 5.
Yes.
So you are very familiar. He wrote about sociology, psychology, neurology, and theology and development in children and how it can hold your family together.
Yes. Yes, and just the deliberateness of the Faith 5 and having that be a ritual and something that you're doing every day, and just that idea of being present for each other. You know, oftentimes when I'm looking at headlines of things in my Facebook feed or things on parenting sites, and they'll say, you know, here are 5 great, you know, parenting strategies that your kids will always remember, and one of them invariably is be present for your kid. Give your child your full attention. Make eye contact. Put down your device. Really listen to what they're saying and try to understand what they're conveying to you. And I think that same type of presence can be so valuable to model to youth and say, hey, we're going to have a conversation. We both have our phones put away, and we're going to face each other, and we're going to see each other's facial expressions, and we're going to read emotions in each other. And, you know, the human eye has developed such abilities to pick up on nuanced aspects of facial expressions and how we communicate. And when our eyes are not looking at faces as much as they are looking down at our phones, we're not tapping into what our brains were meant to do, which is pick up on things as subtle as, you know, a slight eyebrow raise, or even how wide our pupils are dilated, which, you know, we pick up on that even at an unconscious level of like, oh, is this person interested in what I'm saying? So we have a really great opportunity to be fluent users of technology, but also model the richness of face-to-face conversation and interaction without that technology present.
Andrew says, put down the weapons of mass distraction.
Nice.
Nice.
That's a nice bumper sticker.
It is. It is. Which you have to look up to see.
Yes. Yes. So that's sort of a deeper look at 4 of these topics. And again, it was kind of hard to choose which, you know, where to do a bit of a deep dive. There are certainly plenty more, but hopefully this is giving people some ideas for kind of what to look up next. So I want to turn to, in the last time that we have together, just looking at the youth in your midst and considering that they are coming to you from their time not so long ago as children. And really thinking about, you know, even they may just be 13, 14, 15 years old, but what is their past in the faith? And I have sort of 3 little cartoons here that show 3 kinds of youth. They're certainly not the only 3 kinds, but there's the youth who might enter your youth group saying, the Bible, you know, what's that? They really don't know what happens in that book. And I hear that sometimes from people in youth ministry who say, oh, we started confirmation and these kids think Moses was one of Jesus' disciples. Mm-hmm. So that's one kind of kid. Another is the what I've termed the Bible tells me so youth, where they think the Bible is just the rules. Mm-hmm. And the third type, who might have a really sort of vibrant set of experiences to talk about from when they were little and they were going to Sunday school, but we know that that kind of faith experience has to change as they enter adolescence. Yes, their bodies are changing, but their minds are changing. Their ability to reason about things and have abstract thoughts and really wrestle with some of these things. They can't stay in that Sunday school mindset. They have to change, and you are there to help guide them through that. And so my suggestion to you is to take a look at the interview, and this is one of the handouts, but to consider, what if you had a conversation with your youth about their childhoods? What if you asked them about, you know, what do you know about your baptism, or how do you remember learning about God when you were a little kid? I'm not going to read through these different questions verbatim, but what I'm hoping you can do by looking at this slide real quickly is see there are a lot of ways to engage youth in conversation about when they were younger, or they might say, oh, well, when I was a child, right? And they're 14, but they're already looking back at this as a different part of development. So this slide and the next one show these different questions that I developed for a faith formation interview with youth, and just sort of asking them some questions which maybe no one has asked them before. What Bible story did you like as a little kid? What questions did you have? So in sort of the last part of this presentation, I wanted to encourage you to think about the youth in your midst and get a better understanding of where exactly are they coming from by actually asking them, right? Not going to surveys or different online sites or watching videos, but actually engaging in conversation with your youth to sort of understand where they're coming from. And that way you might learn more about, oh, this one really understands, Bible as a rule book, and that's why they're having some struggles with X. Or this one had a really great experience in Sunday school, but they're really grappling with the fact that there's some ambiguities, and there's, now when they get to know a fuller picture of a Bible story, they've got questions. So this is another resource for you to learn more about your own youth and sort of where they're coming from.
And this is available right underneath the recording of this webinar on the Practice Discipleship page will be a link to this handout.
Yes, yes, and feel free to use this and modify it if you'd like, but I did want to kind of close with, I as a Sunday school, primarily a Sunday school developer, our informal motto for developing Sunday school curriculum has become, it's Sunday school, they won't have to unlearn later. And that is because so many people, as they describe their childhood experiences growing up in the church, there's so much they remember about Sunday school that's painful to them or difficult or just wasn't honoring who they were as kids and what they were able to understand. Yep. And so we think that really authentic encounters with Scripture that helps prepare them for moving into youth and the changing cognitive capabilities, that's something we take really seriously in developing Sunday school. So hopefully this is a tool you can use to do that. And also helping them see that faith formation goes far beyond just learning stories from the Bible, although we know those are important, but also expanding to include stories of faithful Christians, stories about the church in action, stories about what your congregation is doing, that as they enter into this amazing period of change and growth and reorganization, this time of adolescence, they get a much broader picture of stories of faith as they are writing their own story of adolescence.
And maybe there's a cross-generational opportunity that you could use some of the questions from your handout for youth to talk to older members.
Absolutely, absolutely. So, so that's the content I have, and don't forget there's plenty of handouts, and we'll have URLs as well. But Dawn, are there any questions or comments that have come in through the comments function that you want to add before we wrap things up?
I'm just seeing that people like it. I think it's a lot to take in, and they are absorbing it right now. So
it is.
Thank you. I did want to give you the last word before we have just a couple of housekeeping announcements. Do you have any closing thoughts? And actually, one is coming in. So give a closing thought, and then I'm going to ask a question.
Okay, sure. I guess my closing thought, it really is tied to this slide that says thank you. You are doing work with a population that most of our culture seems to be afraid of, or maybe disdainful of, or just ignoring of. And there is so much about what you do that is so important, and that maybe no one else is going to know the hard work that you do, but it is so important. And for me, one of the most exciting things about the field of psychology and neuropsychology in particular is that we are learning more and more about the period of adolescence, and especially early adolescence, as one where the brain really has to reorganize itself. And so I want to leave you with the thought of the work that you do making a mark literally on their brains. You are on their minds because you are developing those reorganized pathways in their brains for these big ideas that you're teaching about, whether it's in confirmation or Bible study or just playing together, being together, having conversations together, you are imprinting yourselves on their brains, their very neurons. And I hope you take that as a really exciting and thrilling challenge, and I thank you for your ministry. That is my final word.
Wonderful. I do want to honor that John asked a question.
Okay.
If you could just pop in with a shortish answer, and
sure.
we can connect you to Dawn if you want a longer answer.
Sounds great.
But what age do you make that shift from the literal Bible stories to the analogies, abstract thinking? When does that happen for a lot of kids?
I think for a lot of kids, we're seeing that they're starting to develop the beginnings of abstract thought in, say, 5th or 6th grade, or between the ages of 10 and 12. Okay. There's always going to be variability, but I think starting in 5th or 6th grade, they are ready to look at stories beyond just sort of literal, here's the story arc, and by the way, here's a life application. But starting to understand things more abstractly. I'd say 5th, 6th grade, 10 to 12.
Good. Thank you. And, John, we can connect you to Dawn if you want any more insight on that. But thank you for being here, Dawn. This was great.
You're very welcome, Dawn.
Very fun to have the same name, too.
It is. It is.
So just quick reminders as we wrap this up. This webinar, as I mentioned, along with all the others in this series, has been recorded, and it'll be archived on the Practice Discipleship website at www.practicediscipleship.org. So this is for you. Please download it, share it, whoever needs to hear it. There aren't rules. We want to get this message out there. So volunteers, church council members, adult forums, your colleagues, whoever would benefit, please do share this. You can also download from that same website videos and curriculum from previous years. We've been doing this, I believe, for 4 years, so there is a lot there that you could use with your congregation and your network. Each synod in the ELCA has a practice discipleship coach who's been trained to offer seminars on these webinars locally in your own synod. So training events are posted on this same website, and keep checking back for updates. You can also find event dates on the network app for iPhone and Android, and this free app gives you anytime access. So you get videos, network news, calendar of events, an interactive prayer wall, and much more. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter. Right now, the Facebook page will be having links to some of the things that Dawn mentioned, but we have things ongoing there. So just search Practice Discipleship Initiative, or on Twitter, we are at ELCAPD. Join the network on May 19th for the Third Tuesday Conversation with Karen Stevenson. Her topic is authenticity in ministry and life. Sounds very interesting. And then our next webinar is not until Tuesday, September 1st. It'll be at 1 p.m. Central. And the title is Story of Self and Others with Mindy Mackent. So thank you all for joining us, and we will see you in the fall. Have a great summer, and thank you all for being here. Goodbye.